that has been able to join us tonight. If you've just tuned in, please mute yourself to keep down background noise as we want to hear our presenter tonight. And welcome you all to, I think this is the third in a row of the ASV Maritime Heritage Chapter online presentations. It dawned on me today, we probably ought to come up with the name because it's officially a series now. And we've got 3 more scheduled, which I will discuss momentarily. And I promise you, we are working to overcome the limitations on how many people can join us so we don't have any people get bumped. We are recording tonight's presentation and it will be made available online for those of us who couldn't join due to scheduling conflicts or any limitations on the Zoom call. Good evening. I want to welcome everybody to this month's ASV Maritime Heritage Chapter online presentation. I want to thank you all for joining us as we try and share enduring stories from our maritime past. But before we begin, I want to remind you that next month, Dr. Chris Harrell and Melanie DeMoore of the Submerged Archaeological Conservancy International will present on their groundbreaking work to locate the 1519 fleet of Hernan Cortez. The tentative date for that is Tuesday, April 20th at 6 p.m. In May, we will hear from Nicholas Budsberg about his doctoral research on the Highburn Key wreck, perhaps the oldest European shipwreck located in the New World. The tentative date for that is May 18th at 6 p.m. I've talked with everybody about that. We haven't just emailed it, put on the calendar, but that's when we're going to do it. And I'll send out announcements with Zoom invites for those. And just today, began talking with Dr. Michael Fott, who's very interested in submerged pre-contact landscapes here in the Chesapeake Bay and Virginia waters. And I believe he's going to put together a presentation for us for June. So stay tuned for that and look for the invitations in your email. I'd be remiss tonight without mentioning the passing of several archaeologists this month whose work has affected us all. George Bass is a founding father of the field. His contribution to us is our field. From Cape Caledonia to Yorktown, George Bass forged and passed on a legacy we undertake to continue and to grow. Dr. Cliff Boyd also passed over the bar this month. He was an active part of the ASV and a loved fellow scholar. Virginia in our field mourns his passing as a major contributor to the field of forensic archaeology. And last, Dr. Mike Klein passed away this week. He leaves a large hole in Virginia's archaeology and it's our community. Mike's constant contributions to scholarship and support of young professionals will be sorely missed. Now, on to tonight's presentation. Jim Delgado really needs no introduction, but for those of you unfamiliar with his work, Dr. Delgado has truly been a mover within the field of maritime archaeology. A Silicon Valley native, Jim began his career early as a preservation policy advocate. He successfully petitioned Mayor Norm Mineta to create protective ordinances for the city's archaeological resources. He was then 14. Since then, his career has taken on many challenges and resulted in the publication of over 33 titles, including the most recent War at Sea, a shipwrecked history from antiquity to the 20th century. Jim has served as director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum, head of the NOAA and NPS Maritime Heritage programs, and is now senior vice president at Search, one of the nation's largest cultural resource management firms. You may have seen his work most recently in the acclaimed series Drain the Oceans, along with Dr. Broadwater and the Yorktown Project. But tonight, Dr. Delgado will present on one of the most important archaeological projects recently undertaken. During a time when our national social conscience is in question, archaeological inquiry such as this is important to provide context for positive discourse. While 161 years have passed since Clotilda's bones burned in the Alabama mud, it is possible to shake hands with those who shook the hands of a once human cargo. Cudjoe Lewis passed away only in 1935. Quite simply, the past is always closer to us than we may know, and its effects are constantly felt, even if indirect. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Jim bring the story of Clotilda to us, so please join me in giving Dr. Jim Delgado a warm ASV welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, everybody. I'm hoping that everybody can see the screen and the first slide in the presentation. I want to start first by not only thanking you all for inviting me to speak, but also acknowledging the strong role that is being played by this group in doing archaeology to purpose. Archaeology to purpose, as far as I can tell in the years I've been doing this, has been focused not only on finding and working to preserve and to better understand these resources. It's also been making these resources and their meaning accessible to the public. And that also means involving the public. One of the things I've always believed is that you do not need a PhD to touch the past. And indeed, so many people don't even need a college degree to touch the past. The point is, it's all of our history. And while that doesn't mean we all get to take it home for our mantelpiece, I think it does mean that we all have the right and hope the opportunity to access and learn what these sites have to tell us about. To that end, it was a particularly powerful and words fail me actually in terms of how really to describe how it has been to work on the subject of a wreck like Clotilda. I also want to note that my friend and colleague, Stacy Hathorn, who's the state archaeologist for Alabama with the Alabama Historical Commission, is also online tonight. And Stacy, sorry to call you out on this, but hopefully if there's questions, Stacy might be able to jump in, or if Stacy, if you feel that there are things that you want to add, please do. Because the other part of this, I think, is pretty clear, and that is, as I think you'll see in this presentation, as with any other project, it takes many people to make something happen. And there have been so many folks throughout this entire process that have made things happen and have made a difference. So with that, in 2017, as we often find, a big news story broke first in the country and then internationally, noting that a ship had been found on the banks of the Mobile River in Alabama that was thought to be Clotilda. Clotilda has a particular history that was at first known powerfully locally and then nationally for a while, but to a certain degree had passed out of larger national memory. A Gulf schooner had been built ostensibly for Gulf trade, but as I think we have begun to see through a detailed analysis of the schooner's career, was intimately and integrally involved in slavery and in the business of slavery. It gained infamy by being the last known ship to bring captives from Africa to be forcibly enslaved in the United States when it came to Alabama on July 9th, 1860, as the result of a bet, a wager placed by plantation owner and shipbuilder and Captain Timothy Mayer, amongst others, that in spite of the law in the United States banning American participation in the transatlantic slave trade, he could bring a boatload of people into Alabama with impunity and not face the consequences. This was part of a long-standing discussion between proponents of slavery and the slave trade, and arguing against those who saw the stain of slavery as the original sin which threatened the health of the American Union. And indeed, while it had proved to be economically feasible, had proved to be a cancer which had divided the nation powerfully, and in fact would see the nation sunder itself in a civil war within a year of Clotilda's arrival. Mayer's bet was taken up by his friends and others in the community. And with that, Clotilda, then a 5-year-old schooner, was dispatched ostensibly on a voyage into the Caribbean for trade, but actually across the Atlantic to Dahomey, the kingdom of what is now Benin, to purchase people and bring them back. Under the command of Timothy Foster, a ship's captain who had also built Clotilda for his own use at Mayer's shipyard, Clotilda journeyed across the Atlantic, evaded anti-slavery patrols by both Portugal, the Royal Navy of Great Britain, and the United States. Just 125 people, but only loaded 115 when, sighting a steamer's smoke on the horizon, decided that he was about to be caught and left with 110 people in Clotilda's hold. The voyage was variously described by 3 different participants who were interviewed later in life, the most famous of which is Cudjoe Lewis, whose account was told by Zora Neale Hurston in her book Barracoon, most recently published, but originally noted in notes, and in part through various 19th century newspapers. More recent research by scholar Hannah Durkin has unearthed other accounts and discussions of the voyage by two other survivors of that time who in the 20th century were interviewed and told their stories through the filter of white newspaper reporters speaking on their behalf and recording their stories in dialect. Durkin's research, particularly with Aunt Sally Radoshi and another woman, have just most recently been published and are powerful accounts of the Middle Passage. But back to this story. Clotilda, upon arriving off the coast of Alabama, had originally intended, Foster was hoping to meet Mayer and others. He would transfer his captives onto a steamboat and then take Clotilda to Matamoros, Mexico, where the vessel would be cleaned, repainted, renamed, and re-enter trade. But the parties that he had engaged with not being there, Captain Mayer parked the vessel off the coast, landed, got a horse and buggy, went into Mobile, and there made arrangements. A tug was dispatched, the William Jones Jr., or the Billy Jones as they knew her. She towed Clotilda, dismasted after Captain Foster had discharged his crew, who twice had mutinied, demanding more money when they realized the illegal nature of the voyage. So it was with a group of hired hands, not his original crew, and under the tow of the Billy Jones, Foster crept into Mobile Bay, past federal officials and up the Spanish River, where at nightfall, by torchlight, met up with the river steamer Czar, commanded by Captain Mayer's brother, where the people were transferred from the hold of Clotilda into the hold of the steamboat, and then taken up the river to be landed at Dabney's plantation, naked and scared in the brush as they hid from the Yankees, or that is who, shall we say, the Federals, who the conspirators felt would be soon on to the case. As for Clotilda, Captain Foster then moved her, he said, up the river where he sank. I burned and sank my schooner in 20 feet of water in the Bayou Canal. That story was well known. It broke into national news immediately. But within a day or two, the news was not only throughout the country in various newspapers transmitted by telegraph, but also reached across the Atlantic in time. Federal officials roused, searched and searched, but could never find any trace of the people or of Clotilda, or so they said, though the newspapers did note that a group of people with ability to speak English, speaking only African languages with scarification and filed teeth, had been seen boarding a trade just outside of Mobile, and clearly these had to be some of the people loaded. In short, what I think is very clear when you read the accounts is that this was a crime in which nearly everybody knew something about it, laughed about it, was complicit in it. And to that end, when Clotilda was burned, it wasn't burned to hide it. The vessel was burned to destroy the ready evidence of the voyage it had just been engaged in. You can't sail for that amount of time with people penned in a hold in those numbers without a very obvious bit of evidence, forensic evidence, if we will, from the effluvia, the blood, the mucus, the vomit, the feces, the sweat that would pour out of those people trapped in that hold for that long voyage. And indeed, one aspect of the trade that was well known was that as ships would approach seeking to find slaves being transported on these ships against the law, some captains resorted to taking those people, chaining them to their anchor chain and letting it slip in the deep waters of the Atlantic, dragging the people to the bottom of the sea, leaving only this other evidence which was not sufficient to convict. So the burning of Clotilda was never intended to obscure where the vessel was. And indeed, through the years, various accounts, including historian Emma Roach's account, noted that you could still see the timbers of Clotilda in and around Bayou Canal. We'll come back to Bayou Canal in a minute. So now in January 2017, newspaper reporter Ben Raines reported that he had found a wreck that he thought might be Clotilda in the eastern side or the eastern branch of the Mobile River as it moves around an area known as 12 Mile Island. And that location is within a mile or so of where Captain Foster noted that he had met the Tsar and transferred his unwilling human cargo onto the steamer. This The photo you see here is one of those from AL.com showing the reporter Ben Rain's boat up against the side of this vessel in the mud. This news broke rapidly and it hit the Alabama Historical Commission as well as a number of other people by surprise, in as much as for years people have looked for and searched for Clotilda in a variety of areas. And this, coming out of our own report, indicates in red all of the areas that had been surveyed previously being known as Bayou Canot that had not yielded any definitive evidence of Clotilda. To cut to the chase, the blue area, which is where the wreck ultimately would be found, was only known as Bayou Canot up until about 1940. It was part of an earlier bayou that in French colonial times on maps showed no river channel, but a large expansive bayou or swamp. Canot or Canon, however you see it written on the maps, encompasses this entire area. And it would only be in modern times that this portion would become known as a channel of the Mobile River and not part of the bayou. So with that, it's also important to note that before we get into what was done, that the first thing you do, obviously, when a find like this is made, particularly when you're the agency managing it as you go out there. Ordinarily, of course, people file for permits. They offer a research design. The Alabama Historical Commission had funded and supervised a number of surveys through the years. The reporter's survey was intended to be more of a, let's see if we can find it.
I'm not the person to talk to about that, but I can definitely give you her name and contact information.
So with that, the state quickly had to respond.
Her name is
When
Bonnie.
this happens, particularly with this much
It's
attention
Beta.
from the media, it can be overwhelming, particularly when
Can be reached at
you
14.
have no idea as to what has been found, and this is an area that had not previously been surveyed. Fortunately, a
she's
number
not
of
here
folks
every
stepped up.
day. You can definitely
This
call
included
Bonnie.
the Slave Wrecks Project at George Washington University. It also included the National Geographic,
Different tax credits.
and it also included
Yeah.
those
that's
of
what
us
you
at
want.
Search. I believe somebody is unmuted right now, by the way.
Baden, B-A-D-E-N.
So a number of us, and also the National Park Service through its
Well,
Southeast
I mean,
Archaeological
I know we have grants, but I don't know.
Excuse me.
Center and the
Hi, everybody. If everybody could please mute their, there we go. Thank you.
and the Submerged Resources Center. So a number of us responded pro bono to help sort this out and to take a look at the site. And with that, also began to do some research. And one of the benefits, as John Broadwater can tell you, of having formerly been with NOAA, is understanding that in NOAA's history, it had been part of the U.S. Coast Survey, and that a number of those charts that ultimately would be published were based on earlier surveys, many of which exist only in manuscript form. One of the most powerful of those charts that we found before we went showed the evolution of Bayou Canot into the eastern channel of the Mobile River as it curves around 12 Mile Island. So even today, the area that's charted and surveyed in detail is actually the channel of the Mobile River. The other side, now known as the East Channel, was part of the bayou, and in the original manuscript accounts of surveying, they talked about how the survey crew moved through the bayou. They had to cut saplings and sharpen them and pound them into the edge of where the water got a little deeper, where the flow or the current had moved through, and that delineated, quote unquote, a channel. We ultimately would go out and do some surveying, including some sediment coring, and as you can see there, in just 2 meters, we found this area had never been dredged because you have 2,400-year-old twigs at just 2 meters, or just a little better than 6 feet. So with that, everybody gathered in March with a research design and with permit and support from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Stacy Hathorn, David Conlon, David Morgan, myself, Fred Hebert from National Geographic. Everybody gathered, as well as Kamal Siddiqui from the Slave Wrecks Project. And we took a look at the site. Before we went, another thing, of course, that had jumped out was, and a spoiler alert for any of you who have ever worked at Mallows Bay, I noticed the shipwreck that Mr. Rains had identified as a possible Clotilda showed up in earlier accounts. First, the wreck had been charted. going back into the very early 20th century by the Coast Survey. And it shows up in aerial photos, as you can see here, in 1952, but we'd also seen it earlier. What's important is that you can now, of course, georectify and scale these. And as you can see, we had a vessel which is of a certain size, a vessel that overall was close to 200 feet in length with a beam or a width of close to 40 feet. This was clearly too big to be Clotilda, and it had many of the characteristics and forms and the form of the type of ship that we see at the ship's graveyard at Mallows Bay, something that I and others, of course, had looked at when I was with NOAA, as that now is, of course, a new National Marine Sanctuary, and is the graveyard of a number of temporarily, well, I should say temporary, emergency fleet vessels built of wood, in some cases concrete, and a few others of steel during World War I to offset losses to U-boats. This, while too big, was indicative that this area had been used as a ship graveyard. It was also in an area that we suspected would be Bio-Canoe, that the later map evidence would show. And with that, if there was smoke, there had to be fire, because clearly throughout this country and abroad elsewhere, not just one ship ends up in a backwater like the channel of the river here. There are ship graveyards everywhere. But the point was to go out and take a look at this site. And I think it's important again to say, at this stage and at every stage thereafter, this has never been about trying to find and identify Clotilda. It has been about looking at and understanding all of the archaeological resources that are there, that are visible, that may not be visible, and coming up with as comprehensive a sense of what they are, what their characteristics might be, because the Alabama Historical Commission are the stewards of all the historical and archaeological resources in Alabama for the people of Alabama. And there are various sites in here that will have other meanings and other importance. And the idea in maritime archaeology, with any archaeology, has moved beyond the idea of finding a celebrity shipwreck, if you will, or a very significant shipwreck alone. All aspects of this story are important. And so in this last unsurveyed area of the river, we arrived wanting to take a good look at this to determine what it might be. We invited the reporter, as well as other colleagues, to come out and participate in the study and in the survey, and then to begin to discuss what might follow after that. So in that, we documented the wreck. Here you see Kamal Siddiqui at the bow. For some of you who know vessels at Mallows Bay, you recognize that very large softwood construction, a type of a strap there for the rigging at the bowsprit, all indicative of a late 19th to early 20th century vessel, and most likely, if our suspicions as to which vessel this might be are correct, a vessel built during World War I. Here's Joe Grenan from Search working and documenting that bow. And as you can see, these very large steel fasteners for the very extensive and heavy bow timbers. David Morgan from the National Park Service is back there with Cleet Rooney. They did a fair amount of GIS mapping. Dave Conlon and I, as the older archaeologists, stood back, occasionally waded through this thick mud and supervised. That being said, seriously, we all took a good hard look, and through that documentation, we're able to say not only that this was not Clotilda, that it may be another vessel of a later form, but also with the state and with the state's participation with Stacy there as a co-PI, we also took wood samples, which turned out to be Douglas fir, indicating that this vessel had most likely been built on the Pacific coast of the United States or in Canada. While we were there, we then went to look at different sites. These were all recorded. As you can see, they have archaeological trinomials. Each of them was named for the Department of Natural Resources conservation officers who were there, who drove the boats and participated. A number of these vessels were larger metal structures. A couple of them appeared to be barges, but others appeared to be different vessels, not barges, but perhaps seagoing vessels, either steamers or sailing ships. After we did this work, I'm just going to back up. The most important thing was working with the descendant community in Africa Town. Africa Town was founded by a group of some 30 or more of the survivors of Clotilda, who at the end of the Civil War and with the end of slavery, remained in the Mobile area. Of the 110 people that had been loaded on Clotilda against their will. One, maybe two, perhaps even three, according to the accounts, had died on the voyage. The people that were landed were split up and sent in different directions, sold to different owners. A group of people remained in the Mobile area and worked for and belonged to the Mayer family. When they were freed, the effort that they put into saving money for was to go home. But that did not happen. And so they decided to create their own community on the banks of the Mobile River on property that they asked the Mayers for, but which they had to lease and then ultimately buy. And that community, founded with their beliefs, their social structure, as a portion of Africa in Alabama, as historian Sylviane Diouf and historian Natalie Robertson would powerfully write, was known as Africa Town. And that descendant community remains there to this day, a strong, proud community that faces incredible challenges as so much of the area around them has been rezoned for industrial use, with factories spewing asphalt fumes and others, with a highway cut through the middle of it. And with this, as always, the community has persisted in the face of all of that. Meeting with Africa Town and bringing them up-to-date information before, during, and after the process has always been key. And with that, when we met with them again to say this wreck is not Clotilda, there was a strong sense that it was close to many of them, that they'd always heard it was in the area, the stories had been told, and they believed in their faith that it would be found. State Senator Vivian Figures had come out and joined us. She's a very powerful advocate for the community as well as for all of her constituents and the people of Alabama. And the senator stood on a barge with all of us there and prayed that it would be found, and felt that we were indeed in the right area. Again, I want to stress that throughout the community, it had always been noted that Clotilda was somewhere near where we were looking. And as events would show, the location, the exact location of Clotilda has been an open secret amongst a certain group in the community ever since 1860. So with all of these wrecks, and with that, we then began to work with the Alabama Historical Commission to put together a program for a systematic cultural resources survey of that entire channel. As this was happening, the reporter who had participated in the look with us, fired up with the need to do more, approached the University of Southern Mississippi, and with the University of Southern Mississippi's graduate students and vessel, conducted a hydrographic survey of the river to pinpoint a number of targets that were underwater. And I'm particularly proud of the fact that Candice, that you see here, was ultimately the first person to collect modern sonar data of the wreck that would prove to be Clotilda. It would have been awesome if all of us had known about the survey. It would have been awesome if the data had been readily available at the start. But just as the Alabama Historical Commission announced that the project was about to begin, this survey and its data was released. With that, we were able to reach out. The data was shared. It was helpful, but the magnetometer data was difficult to interpret. It hadn't been done with archaeological spacing to really give us the kind of detail we needed to focus in on things that might be buried. And the sonar data, while provocative, really needed to be followed up. Everything helps, but it was just another reminder that as well-intentioned as you are and can be and fired up with a love of history, it's good for everybody to be at the same table and talking and coordinating. So we then went out, and here you see Kyle Lent and Joe Grenan and Stacy Hathorn mowing the lawn systematically with a very detailed sonar and magnetometer survey. Back and forth across the river, mowing the lawn in this very boring but absolutely essential bit of science, yielded a large number of targets. And all, as you can see here, I'm not going to read this, but we basically found 14 things that bore further looking at. And then we went back and dived them. And in all, 12 different targets, wrecks, if you will, were identified in what we now know to be a ship graveyard. And with that, at the time, we noted they were probably eligible for the National Register of Historic Places as a district. That has been concurred by the National Park Service. and concurred in, excuse me, by the National Park Service. And at this time, those nominations are underway. Just to give you a sense of sort of what we're looking at, here's one of the wrecks that's very close to what would ultimately be Clotilda. It is not a barge, it's an iron-hulled vessel. We have some suspicions as to what this might be, but again, the question here was not to come to quick identifications and to try to put names on wrecks, but rather to see just what was there and do a systematic review. This one pretty clearly, as we looked at it, was not a steamship. It is an iron or steel-hulled sailing vessel of the late 19th century. We have a suspicion as to what this might be, because a vessel of this type was systematically dismantled and cut down to the waterline in post-World War II scrapping in this area on a site that the card that the U.S. Maritime Administration had indicating this laid-up vessel was being scrapped was noted as Bayou Canal. This is a barge. And this is a barge. Being a barge doesn't mean it's necessarily all that modern. They could be older. This, we've got a possible barge, but again, systematically documenting everything was absolutely important, including a variety of wrecks that, well, without a name, and that's not that important at this stage, and we may never get a name for some of them, just the same spoke to the systematic use of this area as a ship graveyard, not in one single event, as would be the case with Mallows Bay in World War I, with a large deposit of ships there, and as well as in other places, but over time. One other target that we looked at of interest were two Civil War ironclads, Confederate ironclads, as well as right next to them. We thought at the time it was a possible Civil War era river jetty. We now know for sure, Stacy, I'm sure it's okay to tell everybody, this is an 1855 piling brick and stone jetty installed by a pioneering German immigrant river engineer who was one of the parents of modern American river control, for better or for worse, whose work included the channelization and the jetty system in the Mississippi River, but also here in the Mobile River. And he also was the architect and the builder of many of the freshwater systems throughout the Eastern United States and well into the South. This is one of the earliest pieces of river engineering that we've seen archaeologically in the country, and it is practically in pristine shape thanks to its positioning in a freshwater river. The ironclads were from the Confederate Naval Shipyard with the associated river-based arsenal and armory up in Selma, and the CSS Huntsville and Tuscaloosa had been known to have been scuttled there based on this 1866 map at the end of the Battle of Mobile Bay at the close of the Civil War. The sites had been previously located, but in this case, again, with a comprehensive survey, the idea was to go and make sure that things were still there. And in this case, both of these wrecks are there and still deeply buried in the mud. And then we came to this target. This target was very provocative. It was covered in trees. It was on the banks of the river. And it was a wooden schooner, partially, well, I should say wooden schooner, I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a wooden vessel, partially buried in the mud. It became the focus of our study because no other wooden vessel other than the first wreck had been seen. As you can see here with the characteristics of Clotilda, she stands out ultimately, as I think we will all see. The dimensions of the vessel are in line with a number of other Gulf schooners. Difference, as we will see, is in the carrying capacity, hence the volume or the fullness of the ship's hold. Built in 1855, built for trade in the Gulf of Mexico, what we ultimately were able to say, just based on the characteristics we found in the records documenting her form for official licensing, was that she was atypical, because while there are other vessels of about her size, their tonnage, that is how much they can carry, which is not a measurement of weight, it's a measurement of how much cargo you can pack into it, was high. And that's going to be an important factor in ultimately determining an identity for the vessel. So here you have what's accorded in her official documents. Interestingly, her final license or registry is missing. And of course, that would be because Captain Foster snuck in and burned his schooner, committing the federal crime of barratry, for which death can be a penalty, as can be the slave trade. And the official records, including his logbook, never surfaced. To give you a sense of sort of what typical vessels were at the time, here you see a topsail schooner of the period behind a river steamboat on the Mobile waterfront, just about the time of the Civil War. That is not Clotilda, and that is not the Tsar, but it gives you a sense, a semblance in a way of what these vessels might have looked like. But coming back to this question, here's a typical Gulf schooner. We went back through this process and looked at the registration, the official paperwork for every schooner registered where the registry survives in the entire Gulf of Mexico. Every port, in some cases already published and available thanks to Depression era cataloging, in other cases going to the archives themselves and pulling out all of that official paperwork. With that, Stacy was there with me as we did a fair bit of this in the National Archives branch in Atlanta. What did we do, Stacy? We looked at well over 1,000 of these from about 1813 up to 1893. And some very powerful trends appeared. Those trends suggested that the type of schooner that you see here in an 1850s naval architectural treatise is not a Gulf schooner. This is a typical British and to a certain degree an American schooner of the period. See how deep the hold is and see how wide the hold is. It's that which gives it capacity to store tonnage. And so we could have an 85, 84, 86 foot long schooner with the same beam or breadth as Clotilda, but it could carry about half the tons. These things were ranging between 50 to maybe 80 tons. Clotilda was at 120. And knowing the way that they would measure and document these with the tax man there on the waterfront, recording this because this is how you paid taxes on your cargoes. They would look at all of this and calculate it. And with that formula that they used at the time, say, okay, you can carry up to 120 tons of cargo, hence there goes your taxes. This is a schooner, 1895 built on the west coast of California, about the size, a little smaller actually than the one that was originally found in 2017 on the banks of the river, also built of Douglas fir. This is the C.A. Thayer at San Francisco Maritime National Historical Park. It's big, as you can see, it's deep. This gives you a sense of what I mean when I talk about the capacity and the tonnage of one of these vessels. That is not the case for a Gulf schooner. And having a sense of this, not only from having been on Thayer and a number of other schooners, but having worked on and documented some of the last surviving Gulf schooners, both archaeologically as well as the last one afloat, the Governor Stone, knew that there had to be a difference, and Clotilda stood out. Ultimately, what we found was that, refresh my memories, I think, but Stacey, I think we had 7 schooners in all throughout that period that had the kind of capacity and the kind of dimensions that Clotilda would have. So not only atypical, but a vessel that would stand out. Now, when we did the surveys and started diving, we had a substantially intact hull in the very dark, murky waters of the Mobile River. On the bank, tending to one side, we could see that we were at the bow because there were no fittings for the rudder that were noticeable. But we were also able, because the form of the hull was defined. In other words, you could follow the curve from one end as it moved to its ultimate breadth or width at midships, and then began to curve back in to meet the stern. And with that, at that stage, we were able to project a length for this vessel in the river of approximately 90 feet and with a breadth that was about 24 feet. Ultimately, as trees moved off and mud scoured through the year, we were able to find, when we did the final measurements carefully, that the breadth at maximum midships is 23 point, a little better than 23 feet. A very close, I mean, practically right on for Clotilda. The other thing that, of course, was important is that as the archaeologists went into the hold, up to 5 feet of depth of hold was still there with the bottom buried in mud with structure above it. That and the form of the hull as they worked through it and as we sonar mapped it indicated that we had a large capacity hold. This was not a shallow hold in any way, or shape, or form. Everything that was there was consistent with not only the dimensions of Clotilda, but the form and the shape of the hull was also consistent with the type of tonnage. When I went back and took the measurements from the team and used the old surveyor's formula from the 19th century, I came pretty close to 120 tons. All of this, of course, meant archaeology by Braille. Here you see Kyle Lent, Alex DeCaro, Deborah Dee Marks, all working in the river. We did not do much in the way of excavation. Much of this was look and not touch, but we did recover fasteners and fittings. Wood samples were taken, which proved to be southern pine. The frames were coastal oak, consistent with Clotilda. I should point out that Clotilda, unlike many other vessels, had been systematically surveyed, not only for the federal government, but with further details for the New York underwriters who would become the American Bureau of Shipping. This was done because Clotilda was insured and was one of only a handful of vessels, interestingly enough, all of them of a certain capacity and size, built locally and not from elsewhere. So with that, we were able to have further details. We knew that with iron fasteners, with yellow pine, and with this white oak, the ship had been built. And every sample, as we looked at it, came back with that timber. But what we also saw, in addition to the everyday corrosion that comes from iron coming into contact with wood in the water, there also were traces of burning, which had also been an important forensic aspect. In terms of a research set of questions as to what could we say that might say it was Clotilda. We brought in a forensic fire investigator as well, who took a good look, and you're going to see a couple of artifacts in a minute that were quite evocative. We also, as we recovered planks, took a look because Clotilda had been sheathed in copper, which was not usual for these vessels, for the voyage to Africa. And according to local lore, the Mayer family had dynamited the wreck sometime in the 20th century to recover and pull the copper off. This is a plank from close to the bow, and as you can see, there's a line of worn holes here that are at an angle. This is indicative of where sheathing overlaps and comes to a point at the bow of a vessel. And what you see there are the wear marks as the copper sheathing over time moved in the current. We know it was copper sheathed because in one of those holes is the shank of the copper sheathing nail, though the copper is missing. So with that, we had a copper sheathed vessel, unusual for a Gulf-built schooner. And we also had the fire. The other thing that was interesting is that when we looked at this, something that hadn't come to mind until we really began to think about it, was the question of the ship's construction. Many of these vessels were built locally and by individuals in family yards, smaller vessels, generic vessels, vernacular craft. Clotilda had been built by Foster, who was a master shipbuilder with a family of coming from a family of shipbuilders in Nova Scotia. The one thing I noticed when planks began to come up were features like this. Here you see two wooden fasteners or artifacts in a hull plank. This hull plank is very thick, very dense. It is the pine. What you see to the left between 6 and 7 is a tree nail, a wooden peg driven in to fasten a planking timber to a frame. It has a wedge in the middle, and as you can see, it's perfectly lined up. Next to it on the right side between 2 and 3 is a plug that covers the head of an iron spike that also fastened that. As you can see, they didn't just do this fast. When they put that plug back in, having bored that out and deep set that head, they tried to line up the grain of the wood in the plug with the grain of the wood in the plank. That type of detail suggested that whoever had built this with a certain level of pride and that this had been a quality built vessel. I say that understanding it's somewhat subjective, but having been participant in the reconstruction and building of wooden vessels, it resonated in a way. Artifacts that we found included a segment of the ship's iron bilge pump pipes, which had been found by our team off to one side of the vessel with broken timbers and other fastenings, all part of evidence that emerged from the sonar as well as the digging that showed at some point an explosive force had been used to blast into the hold. We even found a section or a segment of the ship's centerboard close to the bank indicating, as did some of these planks with the copper off, that somebody had blasted them because a number of the timbers stuck out like porcupines and were not indicative of strikes or snags by ships or of a more recent barge or a tug having hit it. The fasteners, as we recovered them, were iron, as we would see, some of them worn, but all of them not manufactured in a factory per se, but smithed, that is worked by a smith, suggestive of 19th century. Here you see the head of one at the laboratory at National Geographic, and when sectioned and then gone through XRF analysis, proved to be essentially pure iron. This is a 19th century artifact, not a 20th century one, and very different than from the first wreck. Some of the features that we also found included fragments like this, and the key thing to remember for anybody that's seen shipwreck remains from a saltwater environment, what you're seeing here with these fragments of wood adhering to these metal fasteners is not the result of marine organisms. This is a freshwater environment. These fragments, when carefully analyzed by the forensic fire expert, showed signs of alligatoring and other aspects that are typical with wooden fires, with flames wrapping around and saddling these, leaving these briquette-shaped forms adhering to the fasteners. And they're very similar, incidentally, to fasteners and timbers that were observed in the Southern Pine and White Oak built Confederate ironclad CSS Jackson at the National Civil War Naval Museum, which had been scuttled and burned by its crew at the end of the Civil War and left in the Chattahoochee River until the 1960s. All of this, everything we were seeing was consistent with Clotilda. So with that, working carefully, we presented our findings to the Alabama Historical Commission. The report that was done was sent out for international peer review, as well as to colleagues throughout the US. National Geographic also looked at it, and also the AAHC itself took a very careful look. And in the end, our final report summarized and said, we believed that this was likely Clotilda as archaeologists. Through time, without getting into too many details, I will say that the sense now is not a likely, this is Clotilda. That comes from quiet reports from folks in the community saying, yeah, you got it. I don't want to be indiscreet and tell you exactly where the wreck lies. That is not what we do in archaeology, but the location was also quite indicative, shall we say, as to where it was hidden in plain sight. The other thing that we also noted was that the wreck was clearly marked in the early survey charts. So to that end, and I think this is important to say, you'll never hear any of our team say that we found or discovered Clotilda. What we did was apply systematic archaeology to come up with the best possible identification for the site. And everything we did throughout all of the time that we were out there on the river and in the laboratory and in the archives after that was to prove that it was not. And ultimately what we have is a vessel in pretty much a straight line from where Captain Foster transferred the people in 20 feet of water, which has been burned, which is the right size, has the right cargo capacity, built of entirely the right things that had been copper sheathed. And there you have it. So the announcement was made. That did not happen without reaching out to and working closely with the Africatown community. Here you see some of us, you see Kamal standing next to Lisa Jones. She's the State Historic Preservation Officer and the Director of the Executive Director of the Alabama Historical Commission. You see members of the Black Heritage Council, Fred Hebert, National Geographic, members of the Africatown community, Joe Womack, Anderson Flend, Clara Nobles, Deputy Shipowner, Deputy Director, and then some old guy there who was able to bring a talented group of scientists and younger archaeologists out onto the river to work to do this. We did return to do more detailed sonar work, which has revealed further details, some of which was shared with the community earlier in this COVID year on 60 Minutes. At this stage, what's happening now is we are working with the Alabama Historical Commission to prepare the paperwork for the formal nomination and listing of Clotilda, as well as the ship graveyard and the 2 Confederate ironclads in the National Register of Historic Places. Again, coming back to the point that Clotilda, of course, has powerful significance and a meaning and importance to the nation at this time, but to that community and to those descendants. But it is one of a number of archaeological resources which now we know exist in that portion of the Mobile River, all of which are recorded and documented, and some of which potentially may have some interesting stories to tell individually, as well as a collective ship graveyard that speaks to the ongoing development and the changes that have occurred in Mobile's waterfront as a port, as it connects it not only regionally, but nationally and internationally. What this all means for me ultimately has been that I went into archaeology because I believe in, I'm fascinated by, and I like people. And I believe that history oftentimes leaves many people behind. It's not just a question of the past being distant. In some cases, it's a question of who you were at a specific period in time when the dominant narrative did not include talking to people. Those are women and children. Those are people of color. Those are the enslaved. Those are indigenous people. There are very many different people over time. And I can't think of an individual in my own family history who at one stage was not one of those people that nobody else wanted to put into a history book. So when you look at this and you look at the community, when you see people who persisted and survived, like Kosola or Kaja Lewis, when you look at Radoshi or Sally Smith, as she was known in the United States, when you see the evidence, even though there are times when they are not depicted fairly or accurately in contemporary 19th or early 20th century newspaper accounts, but through this, what you see through informed eyes is that they have retained their dignity, their strength, they have persisted, they have passed to their families something important and lasting, which you see today in the community of the descendants that we've all been privileged to get to know better, and who have allowed us to connect to this one piece and to help tell a little bit of this story that they've all known for many years, a story that many said, well, that didn't quite happen. And if so, where's the ship? Well, here it is. And with that, Africa Town, in response to this, is now in the midst of planning, land archaeology, outreach, and a number of initiatives to address this, not only as a special and important place, but again to say that all stories count and all people's lives matter. And that in this case, for these folks in particular, their struggles, representative of a group that were the last, reach back to the very beginning 4 centuries earlier, not too long before my own ancestors landed at Jamestown, that speak to this aspect of the American experience. And so with that, I mean, it's the best ever, I think, way to look at it is that ultimately, for me as an archaeologist, it's been ever humbling, a reminder of what counts and what matters in archaeology, which is people. And again, the power of people working together. This is not just the obligatory, we thank our sponsors and friends slide. This speaks to the power of people cooperating and working together to make something happen. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit about this. Stacy, I'm sure there may be some things I've missed or that you might want to say as the state archaeologist. And with that, I'm going to relinquish the microphone.
Thank you so much. I know I learned some. I've seen presentations on Clotilda before, but I learn new things every time. And thank you, Stacy, for being able to join us tonight. An added bonus. And with that, if people have good, and with that, if people have questions, unmute yourselves, ask, or type them in the chat, and I'll be happy to direct them to our speaker. And thank you too to Paul Johnston. Good to see you. He also mentioned that Patrice Pomey and Dr. Marleveld also passed away this past month. It's been a rough past month for archaeology. So to all of them. I was particularly interested about the cross-sectioning of the fastener and being able to identify not only the material, that's easy, but the style of manufacture. I thought that was, we come across so many wrecks like this, not all of which have the story of Clotilda, but you really have to dig deep and get forensically involved with them to pull out every last bit of evidence.
Yeah.
John Oldfield asks, can you say anything more about the new sonar imagery?
The new sonar imagery depicted the site with some of the trees having moved off. There is, as you could see with the 60 Minutes segment, more of the structure exposed. We now are able to see the bulkhead for the forecastle, as well as a bulkhead that should not exist in a regular cargo going hold. It's a very small one. Don't know exactly what that represents, but the sense is that what we're looking at is what Captain Foster referred to as modifications made to imprison the people within his hold.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's purely conjectural on my part. More work would be needed, but with that, a little bit more of the body of the wreck exposed, so we could definitely see more of the curve back towards the stern, indicating that the length projections are right on, as well as we got a very clear beam now. And the hull is also is there. We've got close to midships, we've got about 6 foot depth of hold, and Clotilda had a roughly 7 foot 11, 6 foot 11, excuse me. So we're pretty darn close, and that would have been a roughly half of that if it had been a typical Gulf schooner.
Thank you. Yeah, and John also provided a nice link to Mallows Bay in the chat. If you have not seen that, Mallows Bay is a pretty fantastic resource up here in the Mid-Atlantic. Let's see. Next up, Jack asks, are there plans to excavate within the hull?
I'll leave that to Stacy.
Yeah, we've got set back a little bit by COVID, just like everybody else, but we're working on contracting the next phase, most of which is going to be scientific analysis that points to how to preserve the site, how best to preserve the site, memorialize the site, but that will include some limited excavation in the hull.
Exciting. Levi has asked, has there been a documentary on this? And John Oldfield promptly submitted the CBS News link to the documentary there, the 60 Minutes segment. What else is out there about Clotilda that we can watch, read?
Well, Drain the Oceans did a Drain Slave Wrecks episode that includes some depictions of Clotilda as it was back with the initial work. You would also want to take a look at National Geographic did a feature magazine story in February of last year that focuses on the people and on Africa Town itself and the response of the community. National Geographic History magazine did another piece as well with some of one of the illustrations that I showed you based on sort of a best estimate of what we know from practice at the time, sense of what Clotilda looked like, illustrating the voyage, talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, I often think probably one of the best things about having National Geographic get involved with the projects is their illustrations and artistry in being able to represent, we certainly saw that with the Betsy, and we now see that with Clotilda. So what a fantastic set of skills, but especially the renditions that can get to people's minds in their pages.
Well, that one picture at the end that showed us all around that big blow up of the National Geographic depiction of their ancestors in the National Geographic gifted that framed piece to Africa Town, and it now hangs in the community to give them a more visual sense of what we've been told for years as children and as grandchildren, as great-grandchildren.
So something I've heard you discuss a bit before, but certainly there was a lot of community engagement with the project. How did that process begin, and how has it kind of matured and continued, especially given the considerations of the past years? You know, communication's not been as easy. We certainly all look forward to continued engagement with that. But how has that kind of come about and happened?
Well, I'll just go ahead and say that we've been working with the Africatown community I've been working with them for over a decade. We put Africatown on the National Register over 10 years ago. William and Mary came down and did sensing in the cemetery and some limited excavation to demonstrate that there's a good bit of terrestrial archaeology left in the community at Peter Lee's house and in the Lewis quarters, which is an area that's associated with Africatown. And you know, these were some of the people over on the we already had an established relationship with Africatown, and we just I guess I thought of it in a very similar way to how I think of Native American consultation. You know, about having the buy-in of the community, and we met, as Jim said, we met with them before and during and after, you know, to keep them informed and to help that, you know, to get their opinions on things, and you know, make sure they were the first ones that knew what we were finding. And we continue to work with them. I mean, Claire Nobles, our assistant director, is even involved in the parts where they're building the welcome center and all. So
I've got to say, in terms of, I've been very impressed, Brendan, working, you know, for AHC and with them on this. This state does it right. I mean, they have their Heritage Council, they have a variety of other forums in which they engage. Their longstanding relationship was there, but I mean, it was powerful to be there, and particularly as a former Park Service person and a former NOAA person working for the public, to see not just that they were talking about it, but that they did it and did it and did it well. It's been good, and we have, I think, you know, move forward with it. I will say, just to say something obvious, that I was very much aware coming into this, that when it comes to trying to tell a story like this, this is not my story to tell. My job is a very specific one as a scientist. But I'm also aware, as I said to the community in an early meeting, Stace, you may recall, I said to them all, standing up there, and I had more of a beard then, I said, I do appreciate the fact that standing here before you today, if I wore a white suit with this beard, you might think I was going to sell you chicken. I said, so with that, not being a Kentucky colonel, but with my own family background, I shared with them that until recently, until the time this project had begun, I had not been aware of my own family's history, because despite my Hispanic surname, I come from a very Southern family. As I said, people who came to Jamestown, moved over out of Jamestown to a certain county, and then moved to Nash County, North Carolina, and thence to Mississippi, where my great-great-grandfather was not only a Confederate veteran, but owned a plantation with 25 enslaved people. And none of this had been known because my parents had divorced at 2 and my mother remarried, and I was raised in a Hispanic family. And yet now here I was confronting this, and in that also noting that one of my colleagues at the Smithsonian, her ancestors had been enslaved on the plantation next to my family's. And so with that, you have to ask yourself how this happens. And so what I said to them all with humility and with emotion was that perhaps things happened to teach us all. And for me, it was an understanding of where this was, and that admittedly in the past, I had felt that because my family had seemingly only come to the United States around 1900, that perhaps we didn't share in the complicity of the crime of slavery. Well, hell, yes, we did. And with that, I mean, however I choose to deal with that, the most important thing was recognizing it and recognizing that history. So I said to them, the Lord may move in mysterious ways, but that I thought now that here I was with them, and that perhaps what Dr. Martin Luther King had said on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in that very famous speech when he said that the day would come when the son of a slave owner and the son of a slave would sit together at the table of brotherhood in the Red Hills of Georgia. I said, well, perhaps, these are not the Red Hills, but here on the banks of the Muddy Mobile River, I come as the son of that slave owner to sit with you. Will you have me? And they've been very welcoming and very wonderful to work with. And it is profound and it is humbling.
Della asks, do you think that DNA may be preserved in the bottom of the hold under all of the lovely mud?
Yes.
Is that, if I could ask more delicately, or I guess continually, is that something that is proposed as part of the research agenda inside the hall, or is that a further step that hasn't been decided yet?
Yes.
Okay.
No, that's part of the, we released an RFP months ago, and that was listed in the RFP.
Okay. Levi Holden asks, how much information is available for grad students for research? And I would assume, Levi, without giving away too much, you may be interested in becoming part of that, having seen your or heard your recent interest in attending graduate school.
All of the reports, minus a little redaction as to where things specifically are available online at the AHC website. And there's plenty of room. One of the things Stacy and I were recently talking about as part of the National Register process, how little has been, there's historical accounts that have been written, but there's so much more that needs to be done, so much more that needs to be researched, particularly in terms of the archaeology and the aspects of the illegal slave trade of 1808 to 1860. And to that end, the ongoing archaeology of the African diaspora. So there's plenty there for all students, I think, to look at moving forward. And there's 11 other wrecks in that river, some of which we suspect have some interesting histories. We have a couple of tentative thoughts as to what a couple of them might be. And I dare say, not to speak for Stacy or anybody else, but if I was a young championing graduate student, I might be looking for what might be possible to tell the story of some of those other ships in the ship graveyard, as well as perhaps more to be done with Clotilda.
Good.
Yeah, and please contact me. My contact information is available on our website. So if there's a student who's interested, I've already been talking to a student from Texas A&M. So
Stacy, if you have it handy, would you mind putting the link to that website in the chat for folks, if you have that handy? And let's see here. John asks, if appropriate to ask, will there be a fourth season to Drain the Ocean?
Yes.
Good. And back to Levi's inquiry. Let's see. I believe he's applied to your alma mater over in Eastern Carolina. So we hope to see some further development out of that. Levi and I had a great couple days working together in the Nansemond River in downtown Suffolk with another really cool old wooden, she was actually a schooner that was built for the oyster trade. Thank you, Stacy. The link is there in the chat for those of you who have not seen it. Sharon asks, if the locals knew the location, why do you think they didn't share it? That's actually a really good question.
That is a very good question. I don't know the answer. It was known to some. And there's a photograph in the Mobile Public Library. Stace, remember when we looked at the original and went, wow, we think the photograph is actually of the wreck from Anna Osha's book about the South in 1914, and there it is. But then again, it shows up on Coast Survey charts. It's just a question of what you know and what you don't know. And I don't know why it wasn't shared, but John Sledge, the local historian who wrote about the Mobile River, talked about going on a trip with one of the family and them saying, yeah, it's somewhere around here. And then they went down the river, John said, and he said, now we're past it, but he didn't point it out. So, but then again, I think people knew about it in 1860. The interesting is U.S. Marshal Cade Godbold and the attorney that he answered for, the U.S. attorney answered for, all within a matter of a year were going to be Confederates. They were all slaveholders. They didn't care. They had a law to uphold, and as long as I see nothing, there it was.
Mhm.
They didn't see that they were doing anything wrong. They felt that their economic interests of the South were being strangled, that the ban on the slave trade was destroying their livelihoods, and that they needed to do this. And ultimately, of course, the Southern states not only participated in the illegal slave trade, but they seceded from the Union and went to war over it. So you have to look at it all from that perspective and how these people felt about it, and the fact that some people may still feel that way about it. And that's
And
not,
the federal marshal Godbolt, his plantation has been excavated, and he was a slaveholder.
Timothy Mayer in a reminiscent account talked about how he bought booze for all of the guys on Godbolt's boat to go hunt for the Clotilda and got them all drunk so they never left the dock.
This is discussed to some degree in the 60 Minutes documentary, but could you maybe touch on the relationship that has been developed between members of the Meher descendant community and family in Africatown?
I've never had an opportunity to meet with or discuss this with any member of the Mayer family. They've kept their privacy and they've kept their silence. In the 60 Minutes documentary, of course, you are seeing some distant relatives come forward. It was particularly interesting to see the distant cousin of Captain Foster there.
Yeah, I guess that was the captain of the descendant of Captain Foster I was thinking of.
Well, he was not even a direct descendant. He's part of the family. The Foster and his wife, Martha Vanderslice, had no children. But I can't speak for why they haven't. The story had been told. I don't know what to say.
It was, I mean, we can't forget it was a crime, as you pointed out, barratry and also bringing the slaves over after it was illegal. So, you know, I suppose they got used to covering up the crime or being circumspect about it, and it wasn't talked about.
My number's listed, as is the AHC's, but I don't know what would be gained for them.
Jack asks, what's the name of the German engineer who built the river structure?
Let me get back to you on that, Jack. I just had one of those moments. I want to say like von Strauss, but let me go back and look at it. He's the guy that did the early water system in New Orleans, as well as the pioneering water system in Mobile, and did some of the earlier work fighting the U.S. Army colonel on what was proper for aligning the channels into Mobile in the Mississippi River. So
I asked the question because there was actually a Prussian engineer who was working with the Confederate Army that built the harbor defenses in Mobile during the Civil War.
different guy.
Different guy. Yeah, it was Victor von Schelia.
Yeah, no, this wasn't von Schelia. It's and we actually saw that we used one of the von Schelia maps to show the position of the revetment and the two ironclads. No, he'd come on over. He'd gone to Napoleon's École, and then as no longer cool to be a French-educated German, came to the United States.
Thanks.
Got heavily involved in waterworks. So anyway, his name will come to me in a second, but I can't remember.
And by the way, those Confederate obstructions are still in great shape too. Search did some fantastic imagery of those.
Well, and Jack Irian actually did one of the earliest surveys on those. Jack is the man when it comes to von Schelia and those obstructions.
It was a great project. That's such an interesting area.
Yeah, actually, I think you did that with Steve James before Steve and I actually were able to shave.
It was a few years ago. And actually, the bell from the Clotilda was still at the church in Africatown back then. It disappeared sometime after that.
Yeah, they've had,
They have a bell in the community, but I'm not sure that's the bell to the Clotilda. Or
It
have
had
you looked at
Clotilda.
it, Jim?
Yeah, it had Clotilda inscribed on it.
it's gone now.
Yeah, it disappeared sometime in the 80s.
It disappeared about the same time somebody cut the head off of Cudjoe Lewis's statue or bust out there, which has now also been replaced.
Right.
Africatown has faced its challenges.
Yes.
Jack, if you don't mind me calling, Jack was one of our peer reviewers, by the way, and thank you for that, Jack. Jack gave it a very good, hard look, as was Harrell.
My pleasure.
Mac McCarthy from Western Australia, Conlon, Stacy, Fred Hebert from National Geographic, and others. So, Kamau.
Well, this has been a real treat. We all very much appreciate you taking the time to present Clotilda to us and all of the things that surround Clotilda. And I know I look forward to hearing from Chris and Melanie next month. And looks like we're planning these things out. So as I say every time, if you have things that you want to hear about, let me know and we will dig up the person that knows the most about it and ask them to come present to us. Thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. It's been a real honor and a pleasure. And thanks again, Jim, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you. You all do great work. Keep it up.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.
All right.
Right.